Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants Hangout. My name is Joe Grabowski. I'll be your host as well as the speaker for today. And I'm really excited for today's lesson, sharing my experiences from the Galapagos and talking a little bit about invasive species in the Galapagos Islands. I was very lucky to be selected this year as a Grosvenor Teacher Fellow by National Geographic and Lindblad expeditions. So it gave me the opportunity to travel somewhere with Lindblad expeditions, and I was chosen for the Galapagos, which, as someone who grew up studying science and biology in university, there was no place in the world that I wanted to visit. And actually, for teachers who are listening in today, the fellowship opens every December, where you can apply for a chance at this professional development experiment with National Geographic and Lindblad. So last August, I spent 10 days in Ecuador in the islands of the Galapagos. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Galapagos and my experiences, and then what's happening in the Galapagos with invasive species. So we just had a class join us. I bet it's Mrs. Lambert's class. If you don't mind muting your microphone for me, I think, oh, there it goes. Good, so we should be good. Thumbs up, everybody can hear me okay. Everybody can hear me okay? Perfect. My class is giving the thumbs up too, so they can hear me. That's good. Obviously. All right, so I'm gonna share my screen now, and I'm gonna take you on a little trip to the Galapagos. So just bear with me for 1 second. There it goes. All right, so right now you should be able to see a map of South America. If anybody doesn't, just let me know. Turn your microphone on, let me know, but we should be good to go. So, all right. All right, so just let me know if it came big. I have it on my side, the meeting side, but you guys should be able to see the slides full size. But let me know if you can't. So here you can see we have South America.
We have got your meeting notes.
You've got the meeting notes? Let me see.
Yes.
How's that?
Perfect. Thank you.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So here's South America. And Ecuador is where we flew. We landed in Guayaquil, which is a city of about 4 million people. From there, we hopped on a smaller plane, which took us to the Galapagos. You can see them out here in the Pacific, about 1,000 miles off the coast. And we'll take a little bit of a closer look at the Galapagos here. So here they are. The Galapagos are a small archipelago of islands, maybe just over 100 miles across, so it's not a big area. And they were formed over what was called a volcanic hotspot. So this volcanic hotspot is right here around Fernandina and Isabella. So those are the youngest islands in the Galapagos. You can see this big seahorse-shaped island. And then as you move towards the east, the islands get older. So San Cristobal, Espanola, are the oldest islands in the Galapagos. Now this hot spot, molten rock makes it to the surface, it cools, and then the islands slowly move almost on a conveyor belt towards the east. So we landed on Baltra, that's also called South Seymour. From there, we spent time on North Seymour, Rabeta. We went around and spent about a day on Isabella and Fernandina. We then came around, crossing the equator to Santiago. And then from there, Santa Cruz. And our very last stop was San Cristobal. That was our last stop on the journey. All right, so we visited about 9 islands in total over the 8 days we were in the archipelago. So this was my ride. This is the National Geographic Endeavour. It's an expedition vessel. It holds about 80 to 90 people, depending on how it's being used. And actually, it was just retired. So there's a new ship called the Endeavour II which is going to make its way out to the Galapagos, and it's going to take over for the Endeavor. So the Endeavors is retired now. So you can see along the bottom, there's little zodiacs, and those were our transport. So all day long, we'd be jumping into the zodiacs. We'd be going snorkeling. We'd be going for hikes. We'd be going for cruises along the coastline in these little zodiacs. And we saw some pretty amazing things. So the blue-footed booby, and there's two other species, the Nazca and the red-footed. You can see this one here is raising 2 young. So pretty busy, be going back and forth all day long, catching fish and then regurgitating. And you can see the one is hoping for a meal, trying to get the parent to regurgitate what it found. And you can see where they get their name. They get this beautiful blue color from the food, pigments in the food that they eat. And then the bluer the feet, the more healthy the bird is. So that's actually how females choose a mate. They look for a mate who has the bluest feet. And this male here is actually showing off his feet to a female to try and get her attention, to show, look how healthy I am. Here's a frigate bird. They're called the pirates of the sky because they're lazy. They don't like to catch their own food. They steal food from other birds when they catch it out of the ocean. So they'll harass other birds until they throw up what they've eaten. The males have this red pouch. They inflate it during mating season, sometimes keeping it inflated for 2 or 3 days to try and get the female's attention. The bigger the pouch, the redder the pouch. That indicates that they'd be a good mate. They can get lots of food. We have land iguanas. These guys are pretty cool. They stake out a territory, usually has a prickly pear cactus in their territory, and that's their food source. And they will guard it, very jealous of other males trying to come in and take their spot, and they will protect it. We spent lots of time in the water, swimming with sea lions and white-tip reef sharks, and the Galapagos is infested with Pacific green sea turtles. Sometimes you'd look around while snorkeling and see 15, 20 or more green sea turtles. It was absolutely amazing. It was pretty cool. Lots of neat birds, including these Galapagos mockingbirds. So there's 4 different species in the Galapagos of mockingbird, and they're found on different islands. And their appearance is very similar, but they are in fact different species. So these 2 were on the island of Rabeta, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. All the shorelines were black with this lava rock, this igneous rock from molten rock that had cooled when it reached the ocean. And the Sally Lightfoot crabs loved this type of environment for finding food and crawling around the coastlines. Marine iguanas, I've always wanted to see marine iguanas. They're the only lizard that can swim in the ocean, and that's where they find their food. So they warm up in the sun on the lava rocks. They dive deep for food in the ocean, algae. They eat it off the bottom of the rocks, but then they have to get back on shore and warm up. If they cool down too much, they won't survive because they are cold-blooded. So another neat thing about these guys is they sit in these groups warming up, and if you watch when I change this slide, you can see this guy sneezing. So they sit around all day and sneeze on each other. And this is actually how they get rid of the extra salt in their bodies. So they have glands in their nose that can take the salt out of their blood. And then to finish it off and get it out of the body, they have to sneeze. So if you're sitting on the beach, it's never quiet in the Galapagos. You can always hear sneezing marine iguanas, which is pretty cool. Flightless cormorants. So normally cormorants you'd find on the mainland, they can fly. But these birds have been on the Galapagos for so long that over time their wings have become vestigial, which means they don't work the way they used to. They've shrunk. They don't put as much energy into developing them because they can find all the food they need in the water, and flight is no longer necessary. So they have big, strong back legs for swimming. And you can see there's a male warming up. He just got back from a hunt. The female's in the middle, and there's 2 chicks on the end. Sea lions, really cool to watch all along the shore. You can see here's a pup, maybe a week and a half old, having a feed from its mother. And then the best part of snorkeling in the Galapagos is every snorkel usually ends with playing with sea lions. The young sea lions are super curious. They tug on your flippers. They pop up in your face and blow bubbles. They love doing somersaults. Ton of fun swimming with them in the Galapagos. So I do have a video, and if we have time, maybe I'll play the video at the end of swimming with a sea lion. And then everybody knows about the giant tortoises in the Galapagos. So originally, it was one species that had made its way to the islands. We'll talk a little bit about how that might have happened in a moment. But then being on the different islands and isolated from each other, they could evolve in different ways. So some species have shorter backs and their necks are low to the ground because they can find all the food they need at a low level. Whereas these saddlebacks, they have a big saddle with long necks because the food that they find is higher up. So they need to be able to reach higher. So actually, biologists say they can tell which island a tortoise came from based on the appearance of its shell, which is pretty cool. And then this was in Santa Cruz. So this is a different species of tortoise. You can see its head is much lower to the ground. And the highlands of Santa Cruz are very moist and rich in greenery. So we went for a hike and found a lot of the tortoises. And just to show you how big they are, there's a duck, a regular sized duck, and there's the tortoise. So you can see they get quite large. And in fact, they get much bigger than this guy. So this guy would maybe be just over a medium-sized tortoise. They can get quite a bit larger. And then there's 3 spots in the Galapagos where humans are allowed to live. Most of the Galapagos is a national park, but there are 3 islands where humans can live. And this is Puerto Ayero in Santa Cruz. And you can see that the animals live right in the city. So this is a bank. So there's not many banks in the world where you have to step over a sea lion if you want to go take out some money. So it's a city of about 18,000 people, and it's right in the thick of things. So pelicans, herons, sea lions are all along the shoreline. They're interacting with the fishermen. And like this guy, he came for a snooze at the bank. So let's talk a little bit more about how things may have gotten to the Galapagos. So these islands would have formed from volcanic rock cooling. And there's lots of different species there. How did they get there? So things like bats or birds or insects, in some cases, could fly. In other cases, seeds could get caught in the wind and be blown to the island. So it's a way that plants could make it there. Another way is through raft dispersal. So storms on the mainland in Peru, in Ecuador, would blow logs and other leaves and debris into the ocean. And sometimes lizards, snakes, tortoises would end up on these rafts, and they would drift 1,000 miles to the Galapagos. They'd be pioneer species, starting a new generation in the Galapagos. So most of the Galapagos is reptiles, lots of reptiles. Why? Because they can survive without food and water for extended periods of time. So the tortoises, the lizards, the iguanas, they had a better chance of drifting across. There's very few native mammals in the Galapagos. There's, I think, a species or 2 of small rodent, and then there's bats, but bats can come across through flight. So there's not many native mammals in the Galapagos. It's mostly hardy species like the reptiles that could drift across the ocean after a storm. So you may have heard this definition, endemic species, and that's what a lot of islands have. Species that are found nowhere else. They're found in one particular spot. So the Galapagos has a lot of endemic species, being an island, being isolated from the mainland, and even isolated from other islands in the same archipelago. And then invasive species. So this is a species that's not native to a particular place, and it was introduced. Sometimes it gets there on its own, but unfortunately, most times we play a role in how invasive species get to island ecosystems, particularly the Galapagos. So humans found or discovered the Galapagos in 1535, and ever since then have been introducing alien species, either by accident or intentionally. So some intentional species, goats, pigs, cats, plants that reminded people of home, food plants, those were brought on purpose to make sure there was food to eat. But some species get there by accident. Rats are pretty sneaky, hiding in the bottom of ships. Insects and weedy plants got to the islands by accident. They weren't intentionally brought. There's 36 vertebrate species, so species with a backbone, that have been introduced. You can see 4 reptiles, 10 birds, 13 mammals. There's even a fish species and some amphibians, so frog species. Over 750 plant species have been introduced to the Galapagos, which is a pretty big deal. And over 500 species of insects have been introduced to the Galapagos. So we're going to talk a little bit about why that's a bad thing. In the Galapagos, the animals living there are very susceptible to an invasive species because they've evolved in isolation. There were no predators, very few predators. There was very little competition. So when a new species arrives that's used to having predators around, that's used to competition, they tend to survive better and can push out the native species. And we're going to share some of those stories today. Some are happy stories or success stories, and some are stories that we're still looking for solutions. So the first one is the island of Rabeta. This is one of my favorite spots in the Galapagos. It's one of the first islands we visited. And as you look at the picture, you can see it's a very red island. The soil and the rocks are very red. This is because it's volcanic rock, and it's volcanic rock that had a lot of iron in it. So the iron was exposed to the oxygen, it was exposed to moisture in the air, and essentially these rocks have rusted over time. So it has a beautiful red color, the island of Rabeta. It was also my favorite snorkeling spot. I was snorkeling with sea lions and white-tip reef sharks, stingrays, fur seals, lots of sea turtles. It was a really cool island to explore. So here's another shot of it as we are going for a hike. And then there's another shot as we went around the back of the island. So what happened on Rabeta? So another name for Rabeta was Jersey Island. And it was infested with species of rodent. So we had your Norway rat, your black rat, and even the common house mouse. They could either get off of ships, they could actually jump off of ships when they saw land and swim to the islands. So why are these guys a problem? Well, they can eat young lizards, they can eat bird eggs, they can eat small turtle eggs. So there's all kinds of reasons why these rats were not a good fit on the island, these rats, these mice. So something had to be done. And it's not easy to get rid of whole species from islands, let alone something as small as a mouse or something like a rat. So this is a problem common throughout the Galapagos, but several islands now are mouse and rat free. And this is how they've been doing it. So Rabeta, the largest species in the Galapagos is called the Galapagos hawk, the largest predator. Okay, the largest native predator. And they hunt things like small lizards, and they'll scavenge. So the first thing they had to think about was how to keep the hawks safe when they got rid of the mice. So their plan was to put poison pellets on Rabeta, which would kill the mice. But if any of the hawks ate the mice, they would die as well. So they actually went around, the conservationists, and caught all of the Galapagos hawks and kept them for a few weeks in captivity while they put the poison pellets on the island. They successfully exterminated all the rodents on Rabeta, and then were able to release the hawks back onto the island. So they've been able to replicate and do this on several islands in the Galapagos, and Rabeta was one of the islands that I was able to visit. So it's an invasive species, but it's a success story because through a little science and a little thinking ahead, they were able to get rid of the mice and protect the Galapagos hawks. So that's one story in the Galapagos. The next story is a story in progress, and it's not a happy story right now. This guy here is the Mangrove Finch. Excuse me. There's only about 40 pairs of Mangrove Finch left in the Galapagos. They are in trouble from a very small species of insect, Philornis downsii, which looks, well, like a fly. And it looks like, how can a fly be affecting birds? But actually, these flies like to lay their eggs in the nest of the mangrove finches. And as the tiny babies are growing up, the flies, the larvae, feed on their skin. They get into their nostrils. They rasp away at their skin, getting little bits of blood, and sometimes can actually end up killing all the chicks in the nest. So the population of mangrove finches has fallen a lot, down to about 40 breeding pairs, which is not a lot. So the Charles Darwin Foundation, which is a wonderful organization in the Galapagos, doing a lot of work, studying animals, studying ecosystems, looking for ways to get rid of invasive species, they decided to do something. And what they decided to do was a two-part program. So the first part of the program was this, was taking the eggs and raising them in captivity. Then after the chicks are big enough, they can release them back into the wild, okay? Little problem with that is it's not cheap. It costs about $19,000 to raise one chick. When you factor in the research that went into it, getting the food, the time it takes for the person feeding it every day, and so on, about $19,000 each chick that they raise. So is it helping? Absolutely. But they have to look at a second thing, which is how can we get rid of these flies? And if you think getting rid of mice or rats is hard, imagine trying to get rid of a fly. And not only that, but not hurt the flies and other bugs that belong there. So you can't just start spraying insecticide everywhere because you're going to kill bugs that are native. So they have a lab at the Charles Darwin Research Station where they are raising these flies in captivity so they can test various things on them. And their hope, maybe they can find something specific that can target them and kill them. Maybe they can find a specific attractant to put in traps that will lure them in and other species won't be as interested in. And then another option would be, can you find a predator and introduce that predator to hunt the flies? Now, that's not my favorite option because you got to be careful. When you've already introduced something that's causing trouble and your solution is to introduce something else and hope it takes care of the problem, sometimes that goes well, sometimes it doesn't. And there's a great example here of a time it didn't go well. So I spent a year living in Australia in 2007. And when you get up into northern Queensland, there are cane toads. And you can see they get really big. And actually this guy is maybe medium sized. They get quite a bit larger. There were these sugarcane beetles. Sugarcane is an important crop in Queensland, and they were eating the crop. So in Africa, there's a predator of sugarcane beetles, the cane toad. People thought, hey, we'll bring the cane toad. It'll only eat the beetles. Problem solved. Well, unfortunately, the cane toad decided, yeah, beetles are great, but so are other bugs. So are other frogs that live in Australia. So are small snakes, and so on. So they started to outcompete other species that belong in Australia. They reproduce like crazy to the point where I think there's over 1 billion cane toads in northern Australia, and they're spreading fast. So now the Australian government's looking for a way to combat the cane toads. There's no natural predator because they're poisonous. They have venom sacs behind their head. So if anything eats one, a snake or a bird, they'll die. So that's an example of releasing a species to solve a problem without actually researching and thinking about what the consequences could be. All right, and the last one I want to talk about is feral goats, so goats that were introduced. So these were having a huge effect on giant tortoise populations. So here's a picture of myself and another Grosvenor teacher fellow who was with me. He's a teacher named Mark from Alaska, and we're on Santa Cruz with a giant tortoise. And you can see another shot here. This is on Isabella with another tortoise. And then Santiago was having the same problem with goats. So there was a problem with goats on Isabella. There was a problem on Santiago, which is another island we visited. You can see it as beautiful, beautiful beaches. So what was the problem? The goats obviously eat a lot of food. They strip a lot of the vegetation. They trample the earth, which leaves less food for other native species. So At first, these volcanic areas of just barren rock between the volcanoes were enough to keep the goats away. But eventually the goats started crossing these areas and getting to other volcanoes and other regions of Isabella where they hadn't before. So you can see the effect they had. In 1977, you can see what things were like at El Cedo volcano. And then 20 years later, you can see that this whole area is stripped and trampled of all its vegetation, which doesn't leave much food for the giant tortoises. Another example here, if we go a little further, you can see what the goats actually do. There were thousands, if not 100,000 goats on Isabella, and they were stripping all the vegetation and leaving nothing for the tortoises. So not only was there no vegetation, but the tortoises are cold-blooded, so they can overheat without shade in the day. Excuse me. So you can see another example. There's no vegetation for this tortoise, but there's a lot of goats. So in 1997, Project Isabella started to get rid of goats from Isabella, Santiago, and Pinta, so 3 islands. They used technology like helicopters for hunting from the air and tracking the goats. And they also used something called Judas goats. So they would take a goat that was sterile, they would fit it with a radio collar and an attractant and turn that goat loose into the population. So that would attract all the feral goats in the area to this one goat. And then since it had the radio tracker, they could find the goat and they could eliminate all the other ones and then leave the goat with the radio tracker to attract more, and so on and so on. And they were successful. So Santiago and Pinta, the goats have been wiped right out. And southern Isabella still has some goats, but the majority of Isabella has been wiped out of all the goats. So what happened when that happened? Well, we lost the goats and all the vegetation started to come back, and really fast. Small trees began to regenerate. Shrub species, seedlings from the forest, cactus, and all kinds of endemic species within a couple years took off again and started to grow back after the loss, which obviously the tortoises were pretty happy about that. Lots of food, lots of shade. Life kind of starts to return to normal when the goats are removed from the area. Now these pictures aren't the greatest, but they give you an idea. This is Santiago before the goats were eradicated. You can see they have fences protecting some of the native species, and you can see the rest of the land is pretty barren. The goats were removed, and a few years later, this is the same spot. It's totally recovered from the damage from the goats. So that's another example of a success story, getting rid of the feral goats, the feral pigs, and giving the vegetation as well as the tortoises a chance to rebound and a chance to survive. Now, a couple other things still worried in the Galapagos: dogs and cats. Wherever humans are, they bring dogs and cats. Unfortunately, they hunt things like marine iguanas. You can see a dog and a cat that have both caught a marine iguana. So now if you have a dog or cat in the Galapagos, they are sterilized, which means you can still have a pet, but they aren't able to reproduce. They've been neutered or they've been spayed and they can't reproduce. Also, you can see ants, fire ants, and a few other species are a big problem in the Galapagos. And you can see this chick is covered in ants. So even something small like an ant can kill something like a baby lizard, something like a seabird chick. So invasive species are still a problem in the Galapagos, and it's a problem that is going to take a lot of time and money to solve. But the government in the Galapagos is doing an amazing job of restricting the number of tourists, of keeping an eye on what's coming in and out, and of working with groups like the Charles Darwin Foundation to find solutions to take out the invasive species and let the native species come back. So I'm going to bring you guys back now. That's what I wanted to share today. Someone in my class can turn the lights back on. And I will stop sharing my screen, and now I'll take some of your questions. So let me bring it back. There we go. All right, so I'm going to start. Just going to check. Mrs. Fairweather, is your class still there? Do you guys have to go?
Yeah, we're good still. We've got about 10 more minutes.
Okay, well, why don't you guys start with a couple questions?
Sure. We had a few questions that we were hoping to ask. Did anybody want to ask them, or do you want me to read them? Go ahead. Yeah.
You showed a picture of a purple cat. Are they
You're very
Do I?
I can repeat it. Go ahead.
He showed a picture of a purple cat. Are they actually purple?
Oh, she was asking a question about one of the photos you had in the slides with the domestic pets.
Yeah. It's just a bad quality picture.
Yeah.
Yeah, the cat's not purple.
Okay, yeah. One of the other questions we had, which one should we go with? The Wi-Fi one. They're wondering if there's Wi-Fi on the island, how the research was being communicated.
Okay, that's a good question.
Delayed.
I muted the wrong mic. There we go. So there is Wi-Fi, but it's very, very expensive and very, very slow. So I was able to do a blog and post some pictures each night, but uploading a video or trying to download a big file is a no-go. It takes a really long time, and you burn through your minutes really fast. So there is Wi-Fi, so the researchers can communicate. It's just not cheap. It's satellite internet, so yeah, it's expensive.
Levi?
What happens when you breed an animal from like another island with an animal that's like indigenous over there?
Okay. Well, if they're completely different species, the definition of a species is that they can't breed. So if they're different species, breeding's not possible, or sometimes they can breed, but their offspring will be sterile, which means they can't reproduce. So that's what happens. You may have heard of a liger, a tiger, and a lion. They can breed, and they do have young, but then their young are sterile and can't reproduce. So if species are close enough, they can reproduce. So some of the giant tortoises can reproduce with ones from another island. But for the most part, if it's two separate species, they can't reproduce because their genes are too different. All right.
Anybody
So we'll
else?
jump. See if they have one more.
We're good?
We're good?
Was there anyone in here that you guys wanted to have?
The one underneath.
Oh, yes, it's a question for you. How did you get into this line of work, and what inspired you to pursue it?
Okay, so I'm a teacher. I teach math and science in Canada, in Guelph, Ontario. And so I also run this organization, Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. So connecting kids like you guys all over North America with scientists, with adventurers, with conservationists. And I started this because I can kind of see what's happening to our planet. I can see that a lot of students don't know about different parts of our planet, about parts that are in trouble, especially parts far away. So Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants is all about equipping kids with knowledge so that they know about what's happening outside of their communities, about introducing kids to new role models, new career paths, and things like that. So I've been very lucky. I get to work with some pretty cool groups, and one of the groups is National Geographic. And I was even luckier to be selected as a fellow to take part in this program and to visit the Galapagos, which was absolutely amazing. So great questions, guys. I know you have to jump off soon, but I'm going to visit now Mrs. Diesel's grade 2s, and they're joining us from Bradford, Ontario. Your microphone's on.
What did they do to you to make sure you didn't bring bugs into the island?
That's a good question. So on the way in, I've never seen this before, but as we were landing, the flight attendants started walking up and down the aisles, and they had spray. And they sprayed all of our luggage in the overhead compartment. So they walked up and down the plane aisles, just coating everything up top in something to sterilize them, so to kill the bacteria, to kill any insects that might have been on there. So that's one way that they try to keep things from coming in from people on flights. If you came in on a boat your boat would obviously be inspected. Anything you were unloading would be thoroughly inspected to make sure there was nothing on it, like some seeds or some insects, even bacteria. And they'd probably spray down the cargo that came off the boat as well. And then they're also very, very strict with when you leave or when you go from island to island. So you can't have more than 16 people at a time with a naturalist. You can't be on the islands before or after dark, so before 6 in the morning or after 6 at night. There's very strict paths that you can stay on. You can't deviate from those paths, which helps protect the area. And then you can't touch or take anything with you. So even a rock or a twig, you absolutely can't take. And if you're found with anything, there's really big fines for removing anything from the island. So they're very careful. They restrict the number of tourists that can visit each year. They're doing a lot to try to keep invasive species from getting to the islands or to keep native species from getting to different islands that they don't belong on. That's a really good question. Go ahead with another one.
How did the rats get onto the boat?
All right. That's a good question too. So ever since humans first started sailing ships, so we talked about how back in the 1500s, the Galapagos were first discovered, rodents were getting onto ships. So ships are cramped. They're usually pretty dirty environments, especially down below in the bilge area, in the storage areas. They'd be storing lots of food, lots of dirt, lots of kind of human waste and such would get into the bilge at the bottom of the ship. And rats love that kind of thing. They love the food. They love that kind of environment. So they'd get on board of the ships. Once they're on the ships, they're very hard to get rid of. And then either when the ship docked at an island, they could get off, or even as a ship passes by an island, if the rats can smell food or vegetation, they're known to jump off of the ships and swim to land, especially if they think there's a good opportunity for more food. And then rats and mice spread like crazy. They have a lot of young quite regularly and are able to colonize islands very, very quickly. So there's a history all over the planet of invasive rodents traveling in ships and getting onto some of the most remote islands, the most remote areas on the planet, because humans and rats go hand in hand. Where humans go, rats go. We make garbage, we make food, and they like that.
Thank you.
And one more question if you have it, or we can go to the next class.
Well, we're good. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you guys. We're gonna visit Mrs. Simoncioni's group. I believe they're joining us from BC, British Columbia and Canada. Go ahead if you have some questions.
Have there been any animals that aren't native to the land that have benefited the islands?
Huh, that's a good question. Not any stories that they shared with us. Now, some of the species that are brought benefit the humans. So a lot of the plants that were brought, unfortunately, were plants that people thought were nice, that they wanted to remind them of home. So they bring them and put them in their gardens. Well, they never stay there. They grow and the seeds get dispersed in the wind. A lot of plants were brought for food, like blackberry bushes, for instance, which again, never stay in one spot. They spread around. So benefit to humans, absolutely, especially the food ones. Some of the species, some of the insects, I could see them being a benefit to some of the larger animals because it's more food to eat. But on a whole, an ecosystem is a balance. It's a chain of creatures that depend on each other. And if you remove something from the chain or add something to that chain, generally something in the population will be affected, and sometimes in a big way. So are there small benefits? Absolutely. There's, insect species can be eaten by some of the lizards and such, but on a whole, there's probably something endemic, something that belongs there that's being affected by what's happened. That's a really good question.
Okay. Does the giant tortoise have a predator?
That's a good question too. A natural predator on the islands, no, because they get big really quickly, and there's, like I said, the biggest predator is the Galapagos hawk. So once the tortoises get to a certain size, then they don't really have anything to worry about. Unfortunately, the predator that they've had to worry about is humans. So tortoises have been wiped out, several species on islands in the Galapagos, because of humans. So in the 1600s, the 1700s, ships would arrive in the Galapagos and they'd load up on tortoises. They would take 20, 30 tortoises, they'd put them in the storage area on their backs, because the tortoises could live for months on their backs with no food or water, and then they could kill them later for fresh food while they were in the middle of the ocean. So native predators, not really. What's been affecting them, obviously, is the goats, which aren't eating them, but they trample and eat a lot of their food. Things like dogs or cats could affect the eggs. So I would guess that some lizard species could maybe eat their eggs. But once they were born and got to bigger sizes, they wouldn't have predators. And there's one guy you may have heard of, Lonesome George. So was a pretty famous giant tortoise. He was the last of his species. He was at the Charles Darwin Research Station for years, and they were desperately trying to find one female. Was there one female left of his species? And unfortunately, they never found one. I can see, looks like Mrs. Diesel's class has to go. See you guys. They never found a mate. They tried similar tortoise species to see if maybe they could get a hybrid tortoise, but he was too old. He never made it. So he passed away a few years ago, and that was the loss of an entire species. And it was due to human overhunting, taking too many for the ships. So one more if you guys have it.
So I was wondering, is there any more sea predators that can affect the birds or any land animals in the Galapagos?
That can affect the birds. Luckily, in the Galapagos, there's not a lot of invasive species affecting the marine animals, which is pretty lucky. There's some species of algae that are starting to get into the marine protected area around the Galapagos that could present a problem. But as of right now, there aren't many marine species causing issues. Birds are very affected by things that hunt their eggs. So if lizard species hunt their eggs, dig them up and eat them, that can have a big effect. Some nesting species like the albatross could be affected if goats and other animals trample through their nesting areas. And then the chicks are susceptible, very susceptible to cats. A lot of the finches, the Darwin finches, which are very famous in the Galapagos, can be hunted by cats. And then we saw that picture of the seabird and the ants. So even insects like the flies and the ants can have an effect on bird species. So those are a few things that are affecting some of the marine bird species in the Galapagos. That's a good question. And then our final group joining us today, if you can turn your mic on. Oh, there it goes. I believe it's Mrs. Lambert's group. How are you guys doing?
Good.
Good.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, so how many species do you think you saved across all of the islands?
How many do you think you'd save, or how many are there?
How many did you save?
Me personally?
You personally, how many did you have a hand in helping?
0. Well, I guess maybe my tourist dollars would go back to things like the Charles Darwin Foundation or the national parks. But we were there for 8 days, and we were with naturalists the whole time, but we weren't doing any hands-on conservation work while we were in the Galapagos. That kind of thing is more something you need permits for. You have to be working with a group to specifically do something like that.
Awesome. All right, next question. Go ahead, Ben.
of bird was the bird that had the fire ants on it?
That was hard to tell from the picture. When I first saw it, I thought it might have been a penguin, because believe it or not, there's penguins in the Galapagos. There's a species called the Galapagos penguin, and the Galapagos is pretty unique because there's cold water currents and warm water currents. So that allows creatures that are cold adapted to survive, like fur seals and the penguins. It also lets warmer adapted creatures like the sea lions to live in the same area. So at first I thought it was a little chick, but now I think, if I'm looking at it more, I think it's more a species, some species of seabird. But it's hard to tell from the little picture. It might have been a little Galapagos penguin, but I don't think so.
Right. Thank you.
All right. Well, that's it. I think those are all the questions we have. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Well, boys and girls, thanks so much for hanging out today. Thanks for your awesome questions and your interest in learning about the Galapagos. I hope I encourage you to dig a little bit deeper. And yeah, I hope it's a place that you guys want to visit in the future. It's not easy to get to, which is a good thing. It's protected it for a long time. A few years ago, maybe 20 years ago, it was in a lot of trouble with invasive species, but things are looking up for the Galapagos. There's a lot of protection and conservation in place. And as long as we keep doing it and doing it in a responsible way, the Galapagos are going to be around for a long time for us to check out and enjoy. So thanks again for hanging out, and we'll see you guys next time. All right, thanks guys.
Okay, well.
Hey guys.